Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Ivan Kanapathy, former Deputy Senior Director for Asian Affairs in the Trump administration's White House National Security Council. A former Top Gun instructor, Ivan was the military attaché at the American Institute in Taiwan. He's a well-known expert on Taiwan's defense. He recently contributed to The Boiling Moat, a new book about the urgent steps to defend Taiwan. So welcome back, Ivan.
Hey, great to be here, Wenqi.
All right, we have to start by asking, what do you think about the attempted assassination of former President Trump over the weekend and his VP nominee, J.D. Vance? Any implications on Taiwan or China?
So for the first question, no, I don't think any implications on Taiwan or China. I sure hope not. I think
it does affect the election, does it?
It could affect the election. I think we're still far enough out from the election, right? I think there'll be bumps in polls, but there's a lot more of election season to go. So we'll see what happens. Obviously, big implications for the Secret Service and the job that they do. So maybe there'll be some issues there worked out here in Washington. But I think enough on that. As far as J.D. Vance goes, I think that's one of the widely expected choices that Trump would make. I think there were 2 or 3 names being thrown out there toward the end, and he was one of the leading contenders. So not surprising. I think he's very aligned with Trump's view, especially on domestic economic issues and things like that. He tends to be, from what we've seen, quite hawkish on China. He has made some remarks about Taiwan that I think are largely in line with U.S. policy. He's quite, I think, skeptical about continuing to fund security assistance for Ukraine, which we've also heard from the right. So I think nothing surprising and nothing that's going to throw a big difference in where the race is and where people are supporting.
Yeah, there's a lot of analysis about what his stance is on China and Taiwan, but he's still a relatively new face in American politics and doesn't seem to have too much foreign policy experience. So we will wait and see. Obviously, they have to win the election first. So we'll turn to the book that you recently contributed to with 2 chapters, The Boiling Moat. I understand that you and the editor, Matt Pottinger, were also in Taiwan maybe about a month ago or 2 to promote this book. So it's really about what Taiwan needs to do to strengthen its deterrence to preempt China's annexation, your chapters in particular. But before we delve into the details, can you share sort of the rationale behind the rising sense of urgency by the co-authors of this book?
Yeah, so the editor, Matt Pottinger, was my boss, at the National Security Council, as you know, and we worked for years during the Trump administration, watching very closely what was happening. And I think it's a continuation of what's been happening for years before that and since that. And by what's been happening, what I mean is that deterrence it's eroding, meaning that China is building capabilities faster in a way that would tip the military balance to a point where they might feel much more confident about attempting an invasion. And so the urgency really comes from that sense that we're approaching.
So it's the changing capabilities of the PLA. At what time would you say, what year, if you can pinpoint that, was when sort of the US side sort of, woke up and say, oh my God, PLA is doing something that, or is modernizing so fast that it's tipped the balance?
So I would say, folks in the Defense Department identified this more than 10 or 15 years ago.
Oh, wow.
But as a whole of government, I would say the Trump administration, right, really kind of pointed to this and wrote, a whole new strategy and a whole new policy direction dealing with China in particular, but cross-strait issues being a huge part of that. And we really accelerated, for example, arms sales, security assistance, security cooperation, exchanges, and training with Taiwan. The Biden administration has continued on that path. And the question is, are we moving fast enough to kind of forestall the eventuality? And we've heard like the date Davidson window, or this date that CIA Director Bill Burns has talked about of 2027. That's a Xi Jinping goal, I guess PLA goal of having that capability. And it may not be an exact date, but I think as we approach the end of this decade, the closer we get to it, the more and more worried we have to be. And so that sense of urgency is what's pushing behind writing this book.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit taken aback when you say, sort of the defense folks have had this awareness for about 10, 15 years, which means this even dated back to maybe before Xi Jinping came to power. So the debate, as we know, in Washington, D.C. has been, or in the world has been, will Xi Jinping actually order to invade Taiwan, regardless of the PLA's capabilities? And you've also said in this book that, Taiwan's military, or at least, some former or even current military ranks don't really believe there's going to be a conflict across the Taiwan Strait. So why do you think there's such a gap in this kind of perception?
So there's always been a gap between Washington and the Taiwanese military, for sure, in that perception, but that gap is really narrowed in the last few years. And so most of my observations that you noted date back to when I lived in Taiwan, which was 2014 to 17, and I engaged a lot with senior members of Taiwan's military at that time. I think, in the almost decade since then, a lot has changed. A lot has happened, obviously, on the world stage, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's, the response to the Nancy Pelosi visit, whether it's, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and how China has been supporting it. Those have all led, I think now, I would suggest many more of Taiwan's senior military leaders don't consider it such an obscure possibility anymore. They think of it as a more real possibility. And I think there is work being done to remedy sort of the deficiencies.
Well, so in addition to this, hopefully, a good development in terms of changing perception, you've dealt with Taiwan's MND, Ministry of National Defense, for a long time. And there's also a chapter in this book saying, it has a very stubborn culture and traditions that may not prepare Taiwan to quickly counter a potential PLA attack. So what are the greatest challenges that you think need to be immediately addressed?
So I think that Taiwan services operate not that differently than our own. They're somewhat parochial and self-absorbed, if you will. And if you let the U.S. Navy decide in a vacuum what it would want to buy, the most advanced and newest and most powerful ships, and our Air Force would want to buy all the newest, greatest fighters. And so it's no different than Taiwan's military would want that. In the United States, we have I think a lot more civilian control on top of the military that has influence and has some expertise to input into that. And I think in Taiwan, there's less of that. Less involvement, so a bigger divide between civilian and the military sectors. And I think that's what is being corrected and really needs to be corrected.
And why do you think there is that divide? I mean,
I think primarily it's historical, right? And when she's better than I do, sort of the history. Of course, now we're going into a third DPP regime, but I would suggest even prior in the Ma Ying-jeou years, the civilians weren't that informed or paid that much attention to what the military was doing. I think there's a cultural difference there, where the military was sort of off and allowed to really do its own thing for many years. And I think a realization now that, political leadership needs to play a bigger role.
Yeah. Well, you also wrote a whole chapter about the scenarios of China's use of force on Taiwan. I have to say, had goosebumps when I was reading through the chapter, and I'm really hoping, none of it would happen to Taiwan. But can you just sort of lay it out there, some of the scenarios that you think, might happen in the case of a China invasion?
Yeah, I think the one sort of most obvious one, and we shouldn't ignore it because it is the most obvious one, and in my view, probably the highest potential, although still a few years away, is the invasion scenario. And I think the lesson from Ukraine that I would take, and I would assume Xi Jinping has taken, is that he really needs to use overwhelming force to achieve his goals quickly, which is what Vladimir Putin failed to do, right? Putin's intention, and everybody in the world, including Washington, D.C., thought that war would be over in a week and Russia would control Ukraine. Well, that's what I think Xi Jinping assumes he needs to accomplish in Taiwan. He can only do that with really a brutal and alarming amount of force, probably leading with a lot of missiles, hitting a lot of the key infrastructure, military sites around Taiwan to before actually, landing troops on Taiwan by 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, who knows, a lot of troops on Taiwan in order to secure it.
So it sounds like it's contrary to some other analysts speculate that instead of taking, for example, the outlet, the islands outside of Taiwan, or blockade or other tactics, it sounds like you suggest that she will basically be very determined and deploy lots of forces, and in one take, just want to take over Taiwan. Is that right?
Well, so I think it's possible he could go for outer islands. I think most likely, as I wrote, would be Pratas Island. Dongsha would be the most likely, just because the Jinmen Matsu are really islands that I think are somewhat helpful politically for China to keep in play, if you will. So, but either way, so I think that is a possibility. But I think the blockade and the quarantines, at the end of the day, from a deterrence standpoint, Xi Jinping can't assume that the Taiwanese people are going to give up, without a fight, which I think a blockade scenario is premised on that assumption. I don't assume that. I have a lot more faith. I've, been visiting, lived in Taiwan for 3 years and visiting there often ever since. And I think the Taiwanese people are extremely resilient and very much love their democracy. And I think in a blockade scenario, they would be very resilient. When you compare it to what the Ukrainians have had to deal with, suffering through a blockade is nothing. It's easy. And I think the Taiwanese people would certainly want to do that. And therefore, I think China always needs in its back pocket, if it's going to attempt any of these gray zones, attempts to take over, to force capitulation, in other words, it would have to have an invasion as a plan B, as the backup. Therefore, from a deterrence standpoint, Wenchi, I think our argument in the book is that, well, as long as you can really make sure he doesn't have that plan B option, in other words, if you can prevent the invasion credibly, then he won't go for the blockade and he won't go for these other lesser options because he doesn't have that trump card in his back pocket.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to, I would say, possible force over Taiwan, you also discuss gray zone activities. Can you say what some of the activities may be or are?
Yeah, so a lot of the gray zone that's happening is certainly concerning, but it's not existential. And I think what we put in the book is that Taiwan really needs to approach the military gray zone, for example, the flights and ships around, and take a look with perspective and with patience. A lot of it is annoying, is a political message, but is it truly dangerous to Taiwan in any way? I would suggest it's not, unless they cross certain lines of territorial space which is 12 nautical miles, or contiguous zone, which is 24 nautical miles, then I think concerns arise. But sort of activities a little further out than that, whether it's the center line or the ADIZ, maybe we shouldn't be paying as much attention to those.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting in your book when you discussed that crossing the center line. Because in Taiwan, it's, almost like a daily news now, how many bombers cross the line, etc. But you do not believe that matters as much. You don't even think the center line is truly the center line, right?
That's right. I mean, it's sort of a figment left over, like the ADIZ, from the Cold War, when the political situation was quite different, and also the military balance was quite different. I mean, I think most people, at least in Taiwan, know that, in the 1960s, Taiwan was flying U.S.-made U-2 aircraft over China.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a little bit of this idea of like, apparently it was okay some number of years ago when the military balance was the other way for Taiwan to infringe literally over China's mainland. But for some reason, China can't even cross in international waters, right, over some artificial center line.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's more sending political message rather than real threats, military threats.
That's right. That's exactly what it is, Wenchi. I mean, we have to be aware that China can lob 2,000 missiles at Taiwan tomorrow without launching a single plane or launching a single ship. So the ships and planes, while important, they're not necessarily indicative of the threat.
Yeah, I hope this message gets out more beyond just sort of the Taiwanese audience. Obviously, Taiwanese are sort of numb and used to it, but the international media seems to play out this, how many bombers cross the center line, and as a threat to Taiwan, when perhaps overlooking what the other signals that China is sending that's more important. I want to switch some perspectives. Obviously, this book is written collectively by a lot of experts from different parts of the world, including one from Taiwan, Enoch Wu. However, I think critics of the book center on this sort of alarm-sounding approach to the Taiwan Strait and a very U.S.-centric view of the Indo-Pacific region, or the Taiwan Strait, or China. And so there are questions, of course, the noise has been there, sort of how much more does the U.S. want Taiwan to do in order to satisfy the demands of the U.S.? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the editor and one of the main co-authors was Matt Pottinger, and then I wrote 2 chapters. So we're former U.S. national security officials, and we think unapologetically about an angle, the viewpoint from U.S. interests. But I would suggest very strongly, and then there are authors from Europe, Israel, Japan, and like you mentioned, Taiwan. Also, their viewpoints included in the book. But I would suggest that those interests overlap from all those countries, and that's what we've tried to show. I would push back a bit, because really the premise of the book, at least the chapters that I wrote for sure, are like, look, Taiwan needs to demonstrate that it wants to defend itself. And that's how it will get the United States to defend Taiwan. Like, not just the promises of like, do we have a defense treaty or strategic ambiguity or clarity? Like, those are all words, right? I mean, but actually doing it matters. And the example I would give you is when, at the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, when apparently we went to President Zelensky and offered him a ride, and he said, I don't want a ride, right? He said something like, I want more weapons, right? If Taiwan does that, the United States and its allies will be there. If Taiwan says, I give up, then that's fine. Also, not fine. It's not what we want, but like, there's nothing more we can do. And that's more the premise of the book, I think. It's not about what Taiwan's doing for America. It's what Taiwan's willing to do for itself.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, but I also have to ask, which is a lot of Tony's people ask,
Yeah.
given how much Ukraine has shown its strength and determination to defend its own country, its own land, it seems that the US, in the end, its commitment is dwindling. So then again, right, it comes another argument, which is, do you rely so much on this approach, which is alignment with the US military defense, etc., or do you try to have a dialogue with Beijing, which may provide another kind of security? I don't know if you have a view on that. I kind of know what you may say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to my previous comment, which is like I don't believe that's where the Taiwanese people are. I think the polling that I've seen over the years shows more and more that the Taiwanese people do not want to live, under sort of a greater China that is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, no more than the people of Ukraine want to live under, Vladimir Putin. And so they are willing to fight, fight very hard on their own, with our assistance, but fight on their own. And so I think it's a good question, that the Taiwanese people obviously ultimately have to make that decision. But my observation is they are increasingly unwilling to join in a political union under the current leadership of China.
Yeah, there's for sure less trust or more distrust in the regime in Beijing. However, going back to sort of strengthening Taiwan's defense and deterrence, there's also an argument that focusing on arming Taiwan and essentially building this military blocks in the Indo-Pacific region may not be viewed, of course, not viewed favorably, but by Beijing, but be viewed as a provocation in the eyes of Beijing. So how do we make sure that we strike the balance? It is truly deterrence, not provocation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise. And I think all the military buildup, if you do it, without too much fanfare, but you have to do it and you can't compromise on it. The true capabilities that are needed in a quality way and in quantities as needed. You do what you have to do, and China will take the lessons it needs to. I don't think it would be provoked. I think it would be deterred. Now, if you do things very loudly and that are more about political signaling without the military assistance, that needs to come, then that's really, I think, the problem. And it's about, speaking softly and carrying a big stick, I guess, is better than doing the opposite.
Can you give some examples when you say speaking loudly, political rhetoric? What may be some of the examples?
Well, I think, there are definitely, the United States doesn't support any change in the status quo, right? And I'll be speaking for myself now that I'm not in government, but I think any indications that Taiwan would want to change legally their status, whether you call it independence or something else, short of that, would be considered a change in the status quo and probably unnecessary at this point, right? And it's if for example in Ukraine, if everybody believed and Putin believed that Ukraine could resist, he wouldn't have launched the invasion, but he believed that he could succeed. So I think ultimately it's still the majority of the decision falls on that evaluation of whether he thinks he can succeed in taking over militarily.
And what would be considered as provocation? What would be the examples that you think will be crossing the line?
I think any further shift toward, independence, I think anything Taiwan would do, for example, toward building a nuclear weapons program, we've seen that in the past. That's something I think China would react very strongly to, and maybe launch an attack for that. Again, like we talked about independence, but But I think the red lines, the true red lines, are actually relatively few. And they like to say everything's a red line, but
Yeah.
have we seen historically, we've crossed a lot of those red lines over the last few years, and China hasn't responded, at least not responded in
What
like.
were some of the examples that we've crossed the red lines?
We've obviously sent, cabinet level officials. We've sent the Speaker of the House over to Taiwan. There's a lot more congressmen going over. And while the gray zone things happen, again, I would challenge you to point to what actual permanent damage or anything significant that has changed from the response from China. I don't think anything significant. We've also done things like station Marines at the American Institute in Taiwan, right? That was a huge red line. Even selling new F-16s to Taiwan was a red line for over a decade that, the Obama administration refused to cross because China warned them against it. And then we crossed it. And you know what? That actually enhances deterrence. So we were afraid of provocation in that case, and we delayed something that would have helped with deterrence, and we got into this deterrence deficit as a result during that time period.
Yeah, so in some way, the US is testing Beijing as well. So if there is a second Trump administration, because this book has many recommendations and some are really good. How would you say the recommendations from this book may align with the possible second Trump administration's policy platform? And for, people that including yourself, who may return to the administration, how would things be different if there's going to be any change in terms of US policy towards Taiwan or China?
Yeah, I think a lot of a second Trump administration policies, again, I'm not speaking for the campaign at all, but I think they would really pick up where the first Trump administration left off in general. And for the policies that were continued by the Biden administration, great. Then they've already moved forward, and we kind of keep moving in that sense. And I think most of the Taiwan issues you can group just in that way, that the Biden administration really has advanced some of the things that the Trump administration initiated. So I see continuity in Taiwan policy, which is good for U.S.-Taiwan relationship. It's not, they don't have to worry about, Taiwan doesn't have to worry about who's in power in the White House. I think largely continuity. There will be little cosmetic changes here and there, as there always are. But I think overall, the team in Taiwan, the government in Taiwan, and I think it would be true even if the KMT came into power, would be comfortable working with either party in the United States.
Well, with that, thank you for speaking to us again. We know that any major changes in DC have a ripple effect on Taiwan's security and place in the world. So as you said, continuity in terms of personnel and policy, as well as predictability, become essential to Taiwan, because after all, I think the United States is Taiwan's most important non-diplomatic ally, security guarantor, and protector. So thank you for playing a big part of the US policy role toward Taiwan, and we hope to have you back soon. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Wenxi. Bye-bye now.
All right.